Welcome. Are we on? Welcome. I'm Herman Perchner, President of the American Foreign Policy Council, and I first want to thank Senator Hoeven for making this room available for us. And I want to welcome you all to this gathering. I think there are few decisions more important in government than those that decide war or peace. In February, American Foreign Policy Council hosted two panels dealing with the question of the role of Congress versus the executive branch in deciding to go to war or not go to war, and other questions of national security. Today we're talking about not who's making the decisions, but how those decisions should be made. What are the lessons we've learned from the past use of force, and how those experiences should guide decisions to use force in the future. Our first panel will be moderated by American Foreign Policy Council Vice President Ilan Berman. Ilan has by this time written hundreds of op-eds, dozens of major journal articles, and you see him from time to time on various TV shows. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ilan, who will introduce the panel and moderate the discussion.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Herman. It's wonderful to see you all here. I'm delighted to be able to participate, to ride herd, I hope, over my panelists. Without further ado, I think it's necessary to to frame the topic that we'll be discussing for the next hour or so. The question of Iraq and the legacy of the Iraq War looms very large in American politics today. We have heard about it on the campaign trail this time, and we've heard about it on the campaign trail for the last decade. And there's a good reason for this. It is an enormously important and also an enormously divisive political and strategic issue. And it's, I think, a very good place to start in our examination of American use of force, the constraints, the parameters, the acceptable dynamics that go into that decision making. To do so, I'm delighted to have two distinguished panelists with me. Phil Giraldi is a former CIA case officer and Army intelligence officer. In those roles, he spent 20 years overseas in Europe and the Middle East working on the issue of terrorism. And he is now a contributing editor to The American Conservative, as well as the executive director of the Council for the National Interest. He holds a PhD in modern history from the University of London. Our second panelist is Mike Doran, who's currently a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. In the George W. Bush administration, Mike served first as senior director at the National Security Council responsible for Gulf affairs, and subsequently as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Diplomacy at the Pentagon. And he holds a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University. And I say those last points, the doctorate, to show exactly how much more educated these gentlemen are than I, and also to prove their bona fides. And I'm delighted to to frame it in that context, because that discussion, the transition from the academic to the political, to the actual, is, I think, a hugely important one, because what we've learned over the last 12 years or so is that what is proper in theory is not necessarily proper in practice. And I think that should inform us as we begin our discussion of the use of force through the lens of Iraq. So let me stop there. Let me invite my panelists. Feel free to sit at your seat. Please hit the button. Phil, kick it off.
Okay. I'm fighting allergies, so I hope you won't mind if I basically read my initial comments. And afterwards you can throw a shoe or a tomato at me as you prefer. There are really two questions here. When is the use of force justified, with the key word abroad? And what have we learned regarding overseas interventions from the Iraq experience? I was, as some of you know, a foreign policy advisor for Ron Paul in 2008 and 2012. So I lean in a non-interventionist direction, but that is largely due to the fact that recent interventions have not worked out very well and have in fact increased the number of our enemies rather than reduce them, while also killing 7,000 American soldiers and more than 1 million inhabitants of the countries we have become entangled with. Nevertheless, I am not anti-war and spent 3 years in Army intelligence during Vietnam, followed by 17 years as a CIA case officer overseas. I believe in robust diplomacy, but I also believe that sometimes active U.S. engagement with hostile entities of various sorts is a price we have to pay to remain secure. The simple answer to when to use force is to defend the U.S. against a clearly defined threat to the country itself or to vital interests. Indeed, unless a vital interest is threatened, then we have no right to intervene anywhere. And how to do it is for Congress to declare war as required by the Constitution. But when you add abroad into the mix, you are suggesting that our country might sometimes best be defended preemptively at a distance. My answer to that would be that it depends on the situation and the nature of the threat. I do not believe in humanitarian interventions, democracy promotion by force of arms, or wars of choice, unless those wars are somehow connected to other vital national interests. For example, if Mexico were to become a failed state, a limited U.S. military role to stabilize the situation near the border might be justified in part on humanitarian grounds, but mostly in terms of national security. To cite the example of Iraq, if Saddam Hussein had indeed had gliders capable of flying across the Atlantic Ocean with chemical or biological weapons, and had the intent to use them, then attacking him would have been fully justified with or without UN permission. But lacking capability and intent to actually threaten the United States, I believe that it is best policy to avoid overseas military engagement, as unforeseen consequences inevitably surface that result in haphazard mission creep. And even when a military option is considered, it should conform to the so-called Colin-Powell doctrine. It should be an unambiguously vital interest. It should be the last available option. It should have a clear and achievable objective with risks and costs clearly explained. Consequences of the action must be understood, and it should have a timetable and an exit strategy. The American people must understand and support the mission, and ideally foreign support should also be in place. I think the lessons learned from Iraq are several, and they reflect failure to satisfy some key elements of the Powell Doctrine. Active monitoring and discussions over Iraq's weapons were ongoing when the decision to go to war was made by Washington, so the war was not a last option. There was, in fact, no vital interest at stake, though that might not have been clear at the time. The objective to bring about regime change was both clear and easily achievable, but there was not much consideration of what would happen on the day after or of consequences for the entire region. There was no timetable and no exit strategy, and the mission morphed into nation building, not a fit task for the military, and also an endeavor which was already in trouble in Afghanistan. But as a former intelligence officer, I would like to consider that there was another problem that quite likely fed into and helped produce the other failings, and that was a failure in intelligence from start to finish. Those of you present who have worked in intelligence know that the CIA was founded in 1947 to prevent another Pearl Harbor by providing the government with objective information regarding what was going on in the world that might threaten either the U.S. or its interests. The key is information, because the intelligence community traditionally is not involved in policy for very good reasons. The best available information provided to the president must be untainted by political considerations to permit the best possible decision. To be sure, the line between intelligence and policy has been crossed more than once in the past 70 years, and information has even been politicized, as in the Soviet estimate, which made Moscow appear to be both more threatening and capable than it actually was. But the lead up to the Iraq War took intelligence tampering to a whole new level. Sir Richard Dearlove, head of Britain's MI6 and a key player in the Anglo-American effort to make a case against Saddam, said subsequently that the intelligence had been sexed up to make it more convincing regarding Iraq's alleged weapons of mass destruction. The so-called Downing Street memo confirmed that the intelligence and facts were being fixed around the policy rather than vice versa, and Dearlove specifically claimed that questionable evidence was being described as solid in making assessments. Meanwhile, on this side of the Atlantic, George Tenet and the CIA were frequent visitors at the White House and fully on board to the fallacious propositions that Saddam had connections with al-Qaeda and that weapons of mass destruction were in the Iraqi arsenal, together with systems to deliver them on target. Sources like Curveball in Germany were simultaneously being discounted by the operations officer, people like myself, who were closest to the cases, even as senior managers at CIA were providing exactly a contrary view to the White House. I was at CIA at the time, and working level analysts were highly skeptical of the case for war being made by those, but those concerns vanished by the time the analysis reached the building's 7th floor, which is where the agency leadership was. There was also considerable intelligence community dissent, particularly over the aluminum tubes, which never made its way into final briefing papers that reached the White House. This rush to war culminated in Tenet's UN appearance to give credibility to Colin Powell's speech indicting Saddam. Powell subsequently described the intelligence he had been given as deliberately misleading. Elsewhere in the system, fabricated information about Iraq seeking yellow cake uranium from Niger was stovepiped through the Pentagon's Office of Special Plans and onto the White House. This was supplemented by false intelligence provided by Iraqi exile and known fabricator Ahmed Chalabi, who eventually turned out to be an Iranian agent. All of this arrived on the desks of policymakers in the White House and almost certainly had an impact on the decision to go to war. I don't know if war would have been prevented if the intelligence product had been better, but it certainly might have caused some of the supporters of intervention to hesitate. As it is critically important to get the intelligence right so the decision-making will be shaped around reality rather than overblown expectations, the firewall between intelligence and policy has to be maintained at all costs. That firewall was broken in the lead up to Iraq, and Iraq demonstrated that bad intelligence produces bad results, just as it did some years later in regard to Libya. As I noted above, I am no great fan of military interventions for practical reasons, but I at the same time recognize that it is regrettably an option that the United States will most likely continue to exercise given the express foreign policies of both major parties. The useful lesson to be learned from Iraq is that basically you have to know what you are doing and why, and you have to understand what you are getting into. The intelligence community can be essential in that process, but only if it deals with issues of concern with both detachment and honesty. To me, the need to restore the independence and integrity of the intelligence process was the single most important lesson coming out of Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. Let me turn it over to Mike for a few minutes.
Thanks. Thanks, Phil, and thanks, Ilan, for having us and for that kind introduction. Although when you said you were going to ride herd over us, it suggested that we're cattle. So I hope I'm not cattle in your eyes. I agree with Phil that what we have to we use force to look after our vital interests. When I look at the experience of the last 10 years or so, I guess we're now at 13 years in the Middle East, what I see is a failure to define our vital interests very clearly, number one. And number two, a failure, I think, to understand the dynamics in the Middle East that are at work. And I think they're the lessons that I would have drawn from the Iraq War. I'll get to a couple of those in a moment. But they're very different from the lessons that the Obama administration and I think the public at large drew from the Iraq War. And I think any of us going forward, we have to take into account where we are in the story at this point, what the Obama administration decided and what the public decided. Let me run through some conclusions I think that the Obama administration decided, which I think are basically wrong. First of all, I think that there's a decided feeling in the Obama administration, and particularly with the president himself, that the use of force itself is almost always counterproductive. I think the president probably goes further than Phil in saying that it's not just a last resort, but that it's absolutely counterproductive. And you can see there's a whole intellectual climate around that attitude. What am I speaking about? For instance, the books by Joe Nye of Harvard about soft power, this notion that we rely too much on our hard power and we should actually be using our soft power to achieve our objectives and so forth. And you can see it in the president's speeches, including recently at the UN. The notion that we really should be working through multilateral institutions and through forms other than our military in order to achieve our aims. So there's a sort of general reluctance to use hard power. And then secondly, there's a specific analysis of the Middle East that suggested that by using our hard power in Iraq, we alienated those elements in the Middle East that would have worked with us to achieve our vital interest, which was to destroy Al-Qaeda, or I think we would now say Sunni jihadism or Salafi jihadism. So as the administration today defines our vital interests in the Middle East, our number one priority is to defeat ISIS, and everything else is kind of relegated to a secondary position. The result of that, once you say ISIS or Sunni jihadism is the strategic threat that we are fighting against, then you automatically, by default, fall into a situation where you see Iran and Russia as partners, or at least as potential partners, and you begin outreach to them. And I think that leads to a disastrous situation like we have in Syria, where we're continually sitting around the table with the Russians and the Iranians, trying to get them to identify this common threat of ISIS. They make a show of concern, but then on the ground carry out a much different policy, which is designed to undermine us and to undermine our allies, which creates greater disruption, which then leads to greater use of force by the United States. I mean, one of the really striking stories in the Obama administration is a very strong impulse on the part of the president to be the president who ended wars in the Middle East and didn't start new ones. On the one hand, combined with a steady increase in the use of force in the Middle East. So obviously, he has not found the diplomatic formula to keep the United States from having to use force, and we see mission creep, and almost weekly now we see mission creep in Iraq and Syria. Another conclusion that erroneous conclusion in my eyes that the Obama administration came to was that regime change, by definition, is a huge mistake. Because we destroyed the system, so the argument went in Iraq, created chaos, and made our life that much harder for us. And so, therefore, when the insurrection began in Syria in 2011, the last thing that the administration wanted to contemplate was a regime change strategy in Syria, which meant, once again, that we ended up, whether we defined it this way or not, we ended up as cooperative partners with Russia and Iran, when they, who have drawn no such conclusion about the use of force, are using massive force on the ground and creating the very chaos that we thought we were avoiding by not using force. One last thing that I think kind of permeates the culture, I don't want to say of the Obama administration, but I think generally on the left, but even beyond the left, I think just in sort of popular culture, I notice when I do a lot of teaching with students from universities, and they're always kind of jolted when I use the term enemy when talking about people. Even adversary strikes them as abrasive. When I talk about countries like Russia and Iran, enemy, they're okay with ISIS, but beyond that, they're uncomfortable with the notion of adversaries. And I think that we need to re-inject that kind of language into our discussion of the Middle East, and understand that there's a struggle for mastery going on in the region, and we have to take a side in that. We can't. Our decision to sit on the sidelines of that doesn't mean that struggle for mastery goes away. It just means that we play no role in shaping it whatsoever. So then, what are the conclusions that I would draw? I have to add one more conclusion that both the Obama administration and I think the general public drew from the experience in the Middle East of the last 13, 15 years, and that's that a large-scale George W. Bush-style invasion of a country is absolutely the last thing that anyone wants to contemplate. And so I think that I would have to say that massive use of force by the United States is really off the table. The country won't support it. But when I look at the experience of the last 7 years of the Obama administration, I have to conclude that we're going to be using force in the Middle East. So it's not whether or when. It's how do we use this force to best effect so that we achieve our vital interests. And I think that from the analysis that I just gave you, there flows a couple of very obvious points. One is we need to define the problem as much wider than just ISIS and Salafi jihadism. It's a problem that has to include Iran and Russia. The way I would put it in shorthand is we have to see ourselves responsible for creating a new order in the Middle East. That doesn't necessarily mean, and it shouldn't mean, a massive nation-building exercise that our country will not support. But it does mean putting together the coalition of powers that are would be our traditional allies, that are supportive of an American-dominated order in the Middle East. Because what the Obama administration has done is it has moved away from the traditional role of the United States as the guarantor of regional order. And we have tried to work with the Russians and the Iranians to create a kind of a concert system where we can all work together to contain or destroy the worst pathologies of the region. That's been a failed experiment in my mind. We need to go back to an older way of thinking, which is allies and enemies, and building a coalition that will support an order on the ground. And that will allow us to build up proxies on the ground who will look after our interests without us having to have a major application of force. This, to me, is the lesson that should have been learned from the Iraq War. The best lesson we learned was the lesson of the surge, when General Petraeus understood that if we work together with the Sunnis of Iraq to provide them with security, they will work with us against our primary enemy, which was Al Qaeda. But in order to give them security, we have to give them security against Al Qaeda, and we have to give them security against the Shiites who want to destroy them. The Obama administration has left that bargain, has abandoned that bargain. And we're now working with the Shiites, with the Shiites of Iraq, with the Alawites of Syria, and with the Iranians to destroy Sunni society. Basically, that's not our goal. That's not what we think we're doing. But that's our power is being applied in such a way that it is giving license to Russia, Iran, the Alawites of Syria, the Shiites of Iraq. to destroy Sunni society. That is only going to create a breeding ground for greater Sunni jihadism, and it's only going to create an instability that's going to further suck us into the region without a clear sense of what our purpose is. So I would say that we should use our force as sparingly as possible, but we should define the goal as to create a new order in the Middle East together with our allies against the Iranian and Russian alliance system. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Lots of food for thought there. Let me exploit mercilessly my position as moderator to ask each of you a question before we open it up. Mike, let me start with you. I think you talked very eloquently about the reaction to the Bush administration's overreach in Iraq, breeding a almost an underreach on the part of the Obama administration, and the negative currents that this has put in place. But to my mind, you talked about the regime change question and the question of whether or not the United States should be involved. I want to take one step back from that. We're 13 years out from the Iraq invasion of 2003, and we've spent billions of dollars of American treasure. We've spent untold American blood on Iraq. And yet the country still remains perilously close to being a failed state. So what does that teach us? Does it teach us anything about democracy promotion, about whether or not this is a bridge too far or whether or not this is a defensible foreign policy priority?
I would put myself somewhere in the middle on that question. I just, if I can give you a long-winded answer, I just happened to reread NSC 68, and I skimmed through this book. I haven't read it yet, about the hawk and the dove, about the divide between Paul Nitze and Kennan. And I was interested to see how Nitze, the basic author of NSC 68, defined American interests in NSC 68. And the interests of the Soviet Union. And basically NSC 68 says the Soviet Union wants to impose its system globally, and it wants to destroy us. That's its goal. And what do we stand for? We stand for liberty and democracy. And he quotes the Declaration of Independence. I think NSC 68 is a great document, by the way. I love it as a strategy. But it's very easy to pick that apart from, to say, is it really true that the Soviet Union is trying to destroy America? Is it really true that the Soviet Union seeks to impose its system globally and so forth? And isn't that a recipe for U.S. overreach and so on? On the other hand, I think that you can't ask Americans to use force abroad. You can't explain to Americans publicly a major endeavor in foreign policy if it doesn't connect up with their basic values. So I think we always have to stand for democracy, human rights, and so forth. But also we have to be judicious and wise about what that means. Democracy and human rights in Iraq is difficult because these are not. You can't have a democratic system unless you have. Democracy is based on the notion of limited government. There has to be a sense of a political community that recognizes itself as a community and that is willing to play by the rules of the game. Iraq and Syria are such divided societies, and everybody every ethnic group, ethno-religious group in those societies has a tape going through their head of how they're going to be raped and murdered when their ethnic rival gets control of the state. So in those circumstances, it's ridiculous to talk about democracy. You can talk about more representative government and so on, but you have to realize that we're going to be playing a continuous role in, like we did in Iraq, as being that element that balanced. We were holding the balance between the Sunnis and the Shiites, and the Kurds, basically, in that country. And we decided that we didn't want to play that role anymore. I think we have to realize that if we want stability, we're going to have to play such a role. It's required.
Thanks, Mike. So, Phil, a related question for you. You talked in your remarks, in the first half of your remarks, you talked about the Powell Doctrine and about being more judicious about what we define as our national interest. So let me push back on that a little bit. So there's another part of the Powell Doctrine that talks about if you break it, you bought it. And how Iraq, his counsel in the run-up to the Iraq War was that we should be judicious. But the second half also holds true. So to your mind, given the sort of, if we're applying the Powell Doctrine across the board with regard to the Iraq experience, what level of engagement after the initial hostilities was acceptable for the United States, and what was an overreach?
Well, this kind of goes back to the intelligence problem that I surfaced, because obviously we went into a country not knowing the dynamics of the country, the history of the country, the culture of the country. We were basically getting information from Ahmed Chalabi, who was an interested party and an Iranian agent. So he to a large extent was shaping the after-invasion scenario, and this was a tragedy. But I would take it back a couple steps further. I mean, the ultimate tragedy is the fact that we went in there in the first place, that the United States had no justification in terms of its own interest for going in there. And I would broaden that critique. The United States has no interest in being in Syria. The United States had no interest in surfacing in 2004 the idea that we should be interested in changing the government in Syria. Syria was a stable place, more or less. It had problems, it had dissidents, but the fact is we, to a large extent by our actions, had created the vacuum in the Middle East and created the situation that we're looking at right now. So my point is you err on the side of caution in these situations. And I think I'm an old 19th century guy in that I believe it's your interests that should be driving all this stuff. It's not a question of promoting democracy because it seems like a good idea. We promoted democracy in Eastern Europe, and sometimes it's worked a little bit, sometimes it hasn't. And this has been true in a lot of other places. If a society is not ready for democracy, it's not going to work. And we tried to install it in Iraq. We've tried to install it in Afghanistan now for 15 years, and it's been a failure. So you have to go to first principles. What is our interest in these places? And the interest should guide what we do. And Powell is right. Once you've wrecked a place, you have a moral responsibility to do something about it. I think we have a huge moral responsibility right now to help take care of Syrian refugees, because I think we were major contributors to the catastrophe which has engulfed that region right now.
Thank you, Phil. I have tons of additional questions, but I think this is a good moment to sort of to throw it out to the audience and see if there are any questions from the audience. I can always circle back with mine. Before I do, let me ask for two things. First of all, please identify yourselves when you ask a question, and then second, please ask a question rather than make a comment. I know this is a topic that's I think near and dear to many people. Sentiments are fine. Please end your sentence with a question mark, though. So with that, let me throw it out. Sir.
Hi, I'm going to invite you to write first, and then Mr. Giraldi. You mentioned the Powell Doctrine.
Could you speak up a little bit on
Yeah, you mentioned the Powell Doctrine and the need for an exit strategy and timetable. Would you agree that more lobbying should be done for Congress to pass a new authorization to use military force that includes something clearly identified as our enemy and others?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we're going to war with somebody, Congress, first of all, should be declaring war. And Tim Kaine even has, I think, a couple times proposed that there should be a declaration of war relating to Syria. If we're sending more and more troops in there, then there should be an explanation, there should be a public debate. And I absolutely agree with that. I think the AUMF is flawed in that it gives too much blanket authority to the White House to start a war and continue a war and then come up with justifications for keeping it going. And we've seen this in Libya, we've seen this in Syria, we'll see it in other places too. I mean, look what's going on in Saudi Arabia, where we're covertly supporting a very destructive Saudi invasion of Yemen. There have to be limits on the ability of the White House to go to war, and I perfectly understand that if we're attacked, the White House has to be able to respond. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about calculated policies, insofar as policies actually exist, to maintain military footings in numerous countries simultaneously. When on September 9th, which I remember because it's my birthday, the Washington Post had a front page article gloating over the fact that over the Labor Day weekend, the U.S. Armed Forces had attacked in 6 different countries and killed terrorists. I mean, we're not at war with any one of those 6 countries. And the fact is that, using military force is a big responsibility. And it's not something to gloat over. It's something to do in a deliberate and legal and constitutional way. That's the way I see it.
Thank you. Anyone else? Sir?
Bob Feather, Senior Fellow, American Foreign Policy Council. One quick point, despite Ilan's, we were using force in terms of a no-fly zone. So that was a much more limited use of force before. My question is, the secondary effects, specifically with regard to Iran. It seems to me in the 1980s, Iran and Iraq had fought 8 or 10 years with huge casualties. Our intervention in Iraq did a lot of things with regard to Iran and therefore with our national interests with regard to the region. So can you comment on that?
Well, let me have Mike start there, and then Phil, you can jump in after.
So traditionally, we've said that a vital interest of the United States is to protect the free flow of oil from the Persian Gulf at reasonable prices, and a kind of corollary of that has been to protect a multiplicity of suppliers and not to let any one power dominate the Gulf. I think that's a vital U.S. interest, and I think it's one of the ones that has been abandoned. Or nearly abandoned in the last 7 years, because Iraq has some of the largest oil reserves in the world, and we have created a situation in which those reserves are increasingly coming under the control of Iran. The Shiite statelet that is southern Iraq is now a satellite of Iran. One of the more disturbing things to me about what's happened over the last 7 years is there's almost no discussion of this and what it means. So have we abandoned the idea that free flow of oil is a vital interest, and that no single power should dominate the Gulf? There should be a debate about that. I think it's a big mistake to do that, and I think we will regret it in the long run. And I think we're going to find ourselves engaged in, as these resources come to under the control of Iran and they use it against us. I think we're going to find ourselves engaged increasingly in military activities that we fail to foresee because we were reading the region incorrectly and reading our vital interests incorrectly.
Phil?
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, to me, the vital national interest in the Middle East is the free flow of oil. Not that we get a lot of oil from the Middle East; it mostly goes to Asia and to Europe. But the fact is, if there were an oil shock, because suddenly 20% of the oil production of the world were stopped, it would affect our economy in a huge way. So yeah, I think it's a vital interest, and I think that by focusing on vital interests, you tend to come up with a better answer. I think in terms of what you're doing, and as Mike has noted, we've created a situation essentially by invading Iraq where we've empowered Iran, and so who was thinking that one through? It should have been obvious to anyone who was an observer of the Iran-Iraq war, which was just a few years before.
Just a quick two-finger on that. I don't entirely agree with what Phil just said. I don't think that the invasion of Iraq is what necessarily empowered Iran. I think it was the failure to think more clearly about Iran when we invaded Iraq to begin with, and then when President Obama pulled back from Iraq to assume that many of our vital interests were shared by Iran when they weren't.
Thank you, James. Sir?
My name is Doran. Let me make a comment first. Regarding foreign policy, after studying history, I think the best way to resolve should be done by that country. Resorting to whatever you call it, not American military power, number one. I don't know if I'm explaining right, but that's correct. Japan, they did the rebuilding themselves. It's kind of like that, you know. Anyway, that's my comment. My question is, you mentioned something about regime change. When should that be used or applied, under what circumstance? In the Middle East, in Asia Pacific? Yeah, I mean.
So let me take the last one first, the regime change. I think that there's been a blurring or an elision of two different ideas when we say regime change. There's so that regime change has become synonymous with massive use of force like George W. Bush did against Saddam Hussein, a military overthrow. I think we carried out a regime change policy against the Soviet Union from the beginning of the Cold War until the fall of the Soviet Union. We understood that we were in a prolonged conflict with the regime, and that conflict came from the very nature of the regime, and that it would never be resolved until that regime went away. And it was the goal of our policy to see that happen. That's different from saying that we're gonna go invade the Soviet Union today and start a major war. I think that those assumptions that we had about the Soviet Union apply today to Iran, and they apply to Syria. So I would like to see a regime change policy against Iran and a regime change policy against Syria. Like I say, that doesn't mean that we should go to war with them tomorrow, but we should understand that. I mean, how do we decide what countries are enemies and what countries are allies? That's the big problem in the Middle East. I would submit as a starting point. It's a more difficult question than one thinks, because there's a lot of frenemies in the Middle East. But I would submit that the easiest way to start is that those countries that overtly proclaim undying hostility to the United States are our enemies. Right? We should let them get a vote to begin with, and that's certainly true of the Iranians. Right? They openly proclaim at the highest levels that they want to throw us out of the region, and that they won't have peace with us until we and Israel disappear. They're an enemy. We should show them the same respect that they show us in that regard, and that would change the way I think we see what the whole dynamics that are going on in the Middle East. With regard to your first question, it's just not the case. Japan, you made a comparison between Japan and the countries of the Middle East. Japan is a nation state. I mean, if we had a spectrum of countries that from perfect example of nation state to hodgepodge like we have in Iraq and Syria, Japan is probably the greatest example of a nation state in the world. So it's possible to work with the civil society to empower certain elements so that they build up their country in that way. When you have these fractured countries like Iraq and Syria, like I say, where different groups feel that they are in an existential, with great justification, feel that they are in an existential struggle with other elements in their society, it's simply not the case that you can step back and things will naturally, and an order will naturally result. We have to be involved in tinkering on the ground. Now, the question is, how much military force should we use in that tinkering? And I would agree with Phil that we should try to minimize it to the extent possible, but we shouldn't kid ourselves. Military force is a key aspect of it. The Middle Easterners do not love us because of our soft power. Well, they don't want us there because of our soft power. They want us there first and foremost, or they don't want us there primarily because of our soft power. They want us there first and foremost because of our hard power.
The Middle East should be resolved by the hand of Middle Easterners, is my point.
If you adopt that principle, you cannot look after vital American interests.
Phil, did you want to jump in?
Wow. Again, I have to go back to basic principles. Basic principles are you use military force when there's a palpable, imminent threat to the United States. I don't see where Iran poses a threat to the United States. It poses a threat to a United States interest in terms of oil flow. I don't see where Syria poses a threat to the United States. So I agree with Mike that we should be putting pressure on regimes in soft pressure, soft power, in terms of regimes that don't like us or that are against our broader interests for one reason or another. But there's something quite different when you go into a country to overthrow the government, as we did in Libya. Let's not just talk about Iraq here. Libya is possibly as big a disaster as Iraq was. And nobody wants to talk about it because we have a Secretary of State, an ex-Secretary of State, who's running for president now, and she was responsible. So anyway, the point is that you have interests and you have capabilities, but that doesn't mean that your capabilities, if you have overwhelming military strength, becomes your option. Yeah, and I agree with you. Countries basically will wind up better if they make their own decisions and make their own mistakes, and still, at the end of the day, come up with a solution that works for them. That's what I think.
My point is, we should be doing everything to help with the insurgents.
Help the insurgents?
Kurds or whatever.
I wouldn't be involved. I wouldn't be involved in someone else's civil war.
Well, let's move on from this. Is there another question? I see a hand raised high. There you go, ma'am.
Yes. My name is Lashani, and I'm a research assistant at the Conference. My question is to Doran. Since he said that Syria is not...
Can you speak a little louder?
I can't hear you.
Since he said that Syria is not a nation state, per se, how could we impose a regime change? Because there will always be instability within the factions, different, the Sunnis and the Shias. One is power, the other one, it will empower the other factions to rise against whoever's in power.
Well, there's, first of all, I would start with an observation, and that is that as a result of the dynamics that have taken place over the last 5 years in Syria, there really isn't an autonomous Assad regime anymore. What we're calling the Assad regime is now completely under the thumb of the Russians and the Iranians, and that's the problem from my perspective, is that the Russians and the Iranians are using Syria as a base from which to spread their power and influence throughout the region. And I'm making a big assumption that I don't think the Obama administration agrees with, that in the final analysis, the Russians and the Iranians have hostile intentions toward us. They want to undermine us, and they want to throw us out of the region or reduce our influence to the extent possible. And that's what we have to be worried about. I think under any possible scenario, whether it's one that is based on my ideas or ideas on the in the Obama administration, there's going to be a lot of turmoil and chaos in Syria for years to come. I don't see, though, what the Russians and the Iranians are doing is they are ethnically cleansing Syria. They are those Sunni refugees, which are now something like half the population of the country. I mean, if you count internally displaced people, not just the UN designated refugees, those people are not going back to their houses ever. And there's going to be a ring of misery around Syria that is going to generate an enormous amount of problems for us, including generating radical jihadi organizations. So if we adopt a regime change policy, which doesn't mean, like I say, that we go in and topple Assad tomorrow, but we start organizing elements around the region to impose costs on the Russians, the Iranians, Hezbollah, and so on, That will allow us at least to create some areas in the country, say pockets of stability, where the Sunni population will not be under threat by the people that are dominating the country right now. That's the best I can offer.
Very good. Let's go over here, sir.
Reed Smith at the Charles Sturt Institute. How were the lessons of Iraq applied or ignored when it came to the decision to topple the regime?
Yeah, let's start there. Well, they were essentially ignored. It was Obama was clever about how he played it, or Hillary and Obama, whoever actually was the architect of it, and that they made it look like a United Nations European operation, though the United States, in terms of logistics and everything, was the driving force behind a lot of it. And but again, you get back to the fact is this was based on false intelligence, essentially. There was a lot of intelligence being generated, just like we're getting now out of Syria, where you can't tell what's true and what isn't, about how there was going to be a massacre of at least 500,000 Libyans in Benghazi. You might recall that alarmist press reporting at the time. And of course, none of this was true. So you had a pretext for war being ginned up, basically because someone had, in Washington, in the White House, had decided that Gaddafi was a bad guy and had to go. And the other kind of pretexts were wrapped around this to make it a viable argument. So what we wound up doing was destroying a state that was quite stable, that had the highest standard of living in North Africa, free medical care and education for everyone and other things, and we've turned it into a hellhole. What responsibility, and also let's not forget the weapons that flew out of the arsenal that Gaddafi had that wound up in Central Africa, that wound up also in Syria by virtue of help from the Turks. So there were a lot of things that went wrong from this operation. And again, it's something that Americans, some European politicians said something about the United States of distraction, about how we forget everything immediately. And it's forgotten just how disastrous Libya was. And this is recent history.
I largely agree with what Phil said. It's kind of surprising how some of the lessons of Iraq, not the lessons that I would have drawn, but the lessons that the Obama administration itself drew from Iraq were not applied to Libya. There was inadequate planning about the post-conflict stage of the operation, which is of course one of the biggest complaints biggest critiques of the Bush administration's war in Iraq. I suspect that one of the reasons that they made this mistake was that they thought that they were applying one of the lessons of Iraq correctly, which was that a large impetus for the war came from the Europeans. The Europeans have a much bigger interest in stabilizing Libya. I actually don't agree with Phil that Libya was a stable country. I mean, clearly there was a serious problem there, but it was the Europeans who had the bigger interest in Libya, and I think President Obama thought that he was applying the lead from behind idea, which is that the U.S. would play the supporting role, but the Europeans would be in the lead. But it turned out that the Europeans ran through their magazine very quickly, and they didn't have the tools or the wherewithal to take care of the job without us. So we had to jump in order to save the situation from becoming a disastrous intervention. We had to jump in and take a much bigger role. So we got kind of dragged into it because of an inadequate understanding, I would say, from the beginning, from President Obama, of the role that the United States plays in the international system and in maintaining order in places like this. I mean, we saw in April Atlantic article, The Obama Doctrine by Jeffrey Goldberg, that the president, doesn't like the Washington playbook, and regards a lot of our allies as free riders. One of the dramatic things that came from that article was the only European ally leader about whom he had uncritical things to say was Angela Merkel, because the Germans have taken themselves out of the hard power game. They're not calling up President Obama on the phone and saying, intervene in this country, intervene there. But the French and the British are. But the thing is, like I say, when you take yourself out of the hard power game, you just leave the field open to those like the Russians and the Iranians who are very much in the hard power business and not looking after our interests.
So let me circle back now to sort of where we started and just ask a final question of you both. So using the Iraq experience and the experience of what we concluded from it and how it's shaped our foreign policy since, where do we go from here? How should that experience, the past experience in Iraq and the years since, help inform how we approach challenges like ISIS on the one hand, a resurgent Russia on the other hand? What have we learned? What haven't we learned yet? Mike?
Well, when I listen to the debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, I see what they're. When I look at the debate about the Middle East and I see what they're saying, and I compare it to what I understand to be the realities in the Middle East, neither one of them is presenting really coherent alternatives, because both of them are saying, using different language depending upon the topic under debate, both are saying that we have to work with the Russians. Number one. And both are saying that we have to push back against the Iranians throughout the region. But Iran and Russia are in an alliance. I think it's an alliance across the region, but it's certainly an alliance in Syria, and it's a very close alliance. So if you're going to push back against Iran in Syria, you're pushing back against Russia. Right? And neither one of them has come to grips with that reality. And the other point I would make is that we have a tendency to talk about all the conflicts in the region like they are in hermetically sealed boxes. So we can have a Syria policy and an Iraq policy and an Iranian nuclear policy and talk about each one of these separately, but they're all connected. So and we're dealing with strategic actors on the other side. So if we start pushing back against the Iranians and the Russians in Syria, well, what's going to happen? The Iranians are going to start shelling the green zone in Iraq. We're going to suddenly find hostages being taken, Western hostages being taken by very shadowy militias and offshoot Shiite militias in southern Iraq, and so on and so forth. We might see the Russians responding to what we're doing in Syria by turning up the temperature in the Ukraine or in the Baltics or through cyber attacks or you name it. So we have to look at it as a matrix, as a complex, and we have to be ready to win the escalation ladder across all fields. And that's something that none of our leaders want to say. They want to say we can recalibrate in Syria and we don't have to worry about the rest of it. And I think it's just erroneous.
Phil, you have the last word.
Okay. I think the lesson learned is that the use of the military as a foreign policy tool gives you a very blunt instrument that produces instant gratification, but in the long term, frequently very bad results. I would say almost invariably very bad results, at least in the last 20 years. So I think it's something you would use only when you have absolutely vital interests at stake. I would have to disagree with Mike. I don't see the threat from Iran against the United States. And I agree with Donald Trump that it is absolutely essential to work with the Russians. If we want to resolve the situation in Syria, we have to work with the Russians. If we want to disengage from Syria, we want to get out of some of these complications we've gotten into, we have to work with the Russians. That's not say I endorse Putin or his policies, but the fact is this is the realistic way to look at the state of the world, and the fact is we occasionally have to bend our knee a little bit I think if you listen to what's been said here today, and if you read the Washington Post in particular, you can sort of put yourself on the other side of the argument. And I would think the fact is that it's not the Russians who are trying to impose a system on the world or the Iranians, it's the United States. We're the ones that are in all these places. We're the ones that are stirring things up in all these places, whether we call it democracy promotion or whether we call it, well, whatever, because these things are basically fake arguments anyway. The fact is, we are the ones that have become engaged in all these places where we didn't have to get engaged based on our interests. And now we're kind of stuck. We've bought into all these things. The Democrats buy into humanitarian invasions of countries to change the regime. The Republicans basically buy into doing the same sort of thing just to show how tough we are. I think these policies are wrong, and I hope that whoever is the next president will figure this out and will start to basically become the country we once were, getting back to taking care of our people within our own borders. Thank you.
I almost wish that you had led with that at the beginning, because that would have opened up an hour of Q&A. But unfortunately, we'll have to cut it short there. As you can see, there's some commonalities, a great deal of difference, and I think the sort of the importance is in the differences in terms of plotting out the proper course and figuring out what the lessons are and what the lessons aren't. So thank you both for what has been an enormously enriching discussion. And please join me in thanking Mike and thanking Phil.